Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Jim's mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice one, Jim. Thank you. Slightly odd combination of background there. Started off as a psychologist, and then I was lured away by the BBC, who then was home for me for over a decade before Channel 4 started in the United Kingdom. A small anecdote there. People at the BBC said, "You must be insane going to Channel 4. We've already got 3 television channels. What would anyone want with a 4th?" I thought they were missing the point, and now in the UK you can get 700 channels and you can get over 1,000 here. The new dimension of 3D. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes, good. I want to try and make the point to you about stereo photography, stereo vision, and 3D TV and 3D movies generally, as representing right now what you could think of as a perfect storm. A confluence of science, technology, invention, application, new ways of seeing the world, new ways of looking at the world, and market opportunities, an audience, in other words. An audience that maybe doesn't exist as fully yet as it might one day, but I'll get to those figures shortly, but an audience nevertheless with an appetite for new technology and new ways of doing things. And this perfect storm is not the first perfect storm in 3D. There have been a number of them, but I think the first one probably started or was centered around 160 years ago in 1851, Victorian Britain. Crystal Palace, the Great Exhibition, the first of the world fairs that then ran every decade or so thereafter. And Victorian Britain and Victorian Europe and America as well was a melting pot of invention and science and ambition and determination and tomfoolery in some cases. But what was happening here was that certain things were coming together in a certain way. Just before the Great Exhibition, Sir Charles Wheatstone coined the word stereoscope, and he rigged up a gizmo with mirrors to demonstrate stereopsis, and to show that it was possible to create what Jim would call a virtual 3D experience from 2 boards with a graphic on them, a couple of mirrors, and you looked at it, and you got the stereoptic effect. Not very practical, really was only there to make a point. Wheatstone was busy fiddling around with electricity and helping to invent the telegraph at the time. He also invented a concertina. But nevertheless, the stereoscope was amusing. And interesting to the people who were beginning to think about the neuroscience of vision. In France and Britain, photography, which had been a bit of a pain in the neck for a decade or so, because the exposure times were, in some cases, 8 hours. You know, stand there, Mabel, for 8 hours. No, it doesn't work. But by the 1850s, photography really was beginning to connect. Even though, I want to point this out to you, this exposure is thought to have taken about 3 minutes in a crowded Parisian street. A crowded Parisian street. But because everyone was moving, you can't see them, except for the guy having his shoes cleaned on the corner. He was standing there long enough to actually register on the screen. Anyway, becoming practical. A Scotsman thought, well, why don't we put stereoscopic knowledge and cameras together and make a stereo camera, and why don't we make a little stereo viewer to go with it, and we can start seeing the world in 3D. And why don't I make my way to Crystal Palace and see if I can get an audience with the young Queen Victoria and her consort, Prince Albert, who was a nut for new gizmos. So he did. And Victoria loved it, thought it was great. Loved the sense of immersion, the sense of being there, the sense of reality that these new stereograms produced. And the whole thing took off. Stereo cameras were to be found in any self-respecting lady's hands. And in this country, the key breakthrough was when Oliver Wendell Holmes invented this thing called the stereopticon. The previous technology that you've seen was a rather upmarket, rather expensive, and for ladies and gentlemen of a certain class. This stereopticon was dirt cheap and worked like a dream, and it was said that 300 million stereograms like this were made in the 3 or 4 decades thereafter, and many of them were in classrooms and in boxed sets and such and such. Now, this is a particularly nice one, not only for the obvious reasons, but because if you can cross-fuse the two images, you'll see that this is a particularly good example of 3D. And when I say cross-fuse, I mean just cross your eyes ever so slightly until the left image imposes on the right image. See if you can click it together, and you'll get the stereo image. Anyone getting it? Yeah, nice one, isn't it? Yeah. Really crisp, really clean. Now, there were 300 million of these, and they had educational use, they had military use, and they, and not surprisingly, this isn't the only scantily clad stereogram you can find. There were hundreds of them, and a lot less scantily clad than that. With that success in mind, the stereographers thought, well, why don't we, the weird French have come up with this thing called cinematography. Why don't we see if we can do 3D cinematography? Well, therein lies a problem. With the stereopticon, it was pretty easy to get the two lenses taking an image onto the one negative or glass plate frame, set that up in front of a very simple optical viewing device, and look at it without any of the convergence or accommodation problems that Jim just mentioned. Dead easy. Now, new technology film. Film cameras running at varying frame rates, 18 frames per second being the typical thing, typically varying film widths, sometimes 12 millimeters, sometimes 8, sometimes 16, and rather rickety clockwork mechanisms. But you had to have these two things running similarly, in sync with each other, through two identical lenses, with film emulsion that was the same film emulsion on both sides, and with film emulsion differences, you'll get differences in brightness and differences in contrast. So you're really asking for trouble when you start putting two cameras together, which are so bulky that you're unlikely to be able to achieve their interocular distance that, that Jim was telling you about. But they worked at it, and they began to do this sort of thing and try their best to make it work. But remember that unlike the stereogram or the stereopticon, once you've got the two films, you then have to edit them identically. You have to grade them identically if you can, and then you have to project them identically through a display system that the audience can then watch. And it was not a huge success, it must be said. The very first display of a stereo movie to anyone anywhere was 2 blocks from here in what is now the Marriott Marquis of Times Square. At that time, it was the Astor Theatre, and that was in 1922. Sorry, wrong, that was in 1915. In 1922, the first paying film using anaglyph glasses was a film called The Power of Love. That was followed the next year, and that's a scene from The Power of Love, and you can see the red-green displacement that where you're looking at this through anaglyph glasses would seem to be a stereo image for you. Next year came The Men from Mars, which was a resounding flop. And it was a resounding flop for 2 reasons. Firstly, the film was crap. But secondly, the technology used to acquire it and then display it was a real nightmare. And that combination of it being costly and unwieldy and difficult to achieve technically, along with creative and content problems meant that 3D kind of, it was there, it puttered along over the next decade or two or three, but nobody really was paying very much attention to it because the talkies were coming and more flexible cinematography and cinema technology was coming. And so people didn't need to mess around with something like this. They did, but they didn't need to. Not really until this guy, Edwin Land, famous for the Polaroid camera that he's holding, basically invented the polarizing filter. The polarizing filter, he was a 3D nut. He wanted to do 3D instant movies, would you believe? He was revolutionary in helping to devise the 3D camera technology that flew in the U-2 spy planes. He was an advocate of the 3D technology, but it was the polarizing filter that made the difference. And why? Because up until that point in time, with anaglyph glasses, you could only have black and white, basically. And everyone was getting used to this new thing called color, Technicolor. And so it was at the World's Fair. Remember great exhibition? The World's Fair of 1940, Plymouth, the car manufacturers, displayed a 3D time-lapse movie of a Plymouth sedan being made. I don't think a copy of it exists, unfortunately, but at that time, it was the most viewed 3D movie ever. Now, again, think about this sort of, there they are enjoying it. Think about this confluence, this perfect storm notion that I'm trying to get across to you. Off the back end of that experience in World War II, and quite a lot of important technical advances that were made in the realms of cinematography and stereography during World War II, we arrived in the early 50s the movie industry, arrived in the early 50s with a problem, and the problem was called television. These beastly television people were going to steal our audiences. So what do? We went back to 3D. And Buona Devil, marvel of a lifetime, a lion in your lap, it says, a lover in your arms. Who could resist that? Buona Devil was a wonderful film made by Arch Obola and is generally regarded as having kicked off the 3D surge, but not as much as this one. This House of Wax, again using the polarizing filters which were now common, not very much anaglyph left, House of Wax made history for two reasons. The first was that it was the first 3D movie to get into the annual box office top 10 for that year, which was 1953. But the second was because it was probably the first 3D movie to be made by a one-eyed director. Think about that for a moment. Anyway, André de Toth, brilliant guy. Now, of course, movies have begun to adopt 3D once again now, and I'm arguing to you that the perfect storms that we've seen, and sometimes the imperfect storms that we've seen, is actually upon us once again. And again, once again, it's because of a technological set of advances that have impacted on capture, image capture, and image display. And it's the digital revolution. Up until the 1980s, I was certainly shooting on film, 16mm Eastman Kodak NAV, and it was wonderful stuff. But around about the late 80s, we were transitioning away from film to tape, we were transitioning away from analog to digital, and that was happening on location and in the studio, and it was happening in the cutting rooms and in the post-production facilities and in the graphics and animation studios as well. And that trigger, the digital trigger of the late 1980s, early 1990s, has led to a situation now where currently in production, there are slightly over 100 3D feature films in production right now. Now that's about half as many as were made in the entirety of the prior 80 years. There's probably around 400 or so 3D movies that have ever been made, and 100 of them or so are being made now. There are some 25,000 3D movie theaters around the world, and conservatively 7,000 of them are here in the United States. This is, you know, this is not just a fad. This isn't kipper ties and bell bottoms. This is here, and it's real. In terms of 3D TVs, and you know, Avatar, I should mention, the first movie ever to break the $2 billion box office take-home around the world. Quite extraordinary success. So everyone's doing 3D now. For those of you who don't know, this is a green screen setup where in a digital environment you can put anything you like behind the actor and the mannequin on the stand there. So you could have him on the top of the Empire State Building or in the Grand Canyon or whatever, simply by replacing the green with the image of your choice. The interesting thing that's happening now is that with 3D television, we know that there have been about 3.5 million 3D TV sets sold around the world so far, about 1 million or so of them here in the United States. Estimates vary, but I've heard projections over the next 5 to 10 years that take it to 20 to 40 or more million sets around the world. And I wouldn't be too surprised, frankly. One of the problems that we're facing is actually the provision of good content for TV. The movies are being made, but 3D TV isn't happening or isn't producing content as quickly as one might want. But nevertheless, there are now conservatively, well, it depends how you do the sums, but there are about 20 3D TV channels around the world, a couple or three of them in this country. And there are a lot more television channels that have experimented with 3D. You've probably seen that 3Net is the new collaboration between Discovery, Sony, and IMAX. There are a number of these collaborations coming on, and you may have seen in the news, was it last week or the week before, that Sony have decided to be transmitting Wimbledon this year in 3D, which makes an interesting point that I'll mention briefly, and that is that not everything demands being shot in 3D. There are certain things that really work in 3D and certain things that frankly don't much need it. And given the amount of trouble and money it takes to make the stuff, you don't necessarily have to go that route. But to give you an example, underwater material works fabulously in 3D. Space exploration and astronomy and things like that work very well in 3D. Anything that is in a proscenium type setting, ballet, opera, stage theatre, concerts, works very well in 3D. Surprisingly, natural history doesn't. And it has to do with, technically, it has to do with lens lengths. If your action is taking place between about 5 feet away from you to about 30 feet away from you, you're in the sweet spot for 3D. If your cheetah or elephant or tiger is half a mile away, it's not going to work. So we have to choose carefully what subjects we're going to cover in 3D. And the reason that's important is because we can't afford to offer our audiences bad 3D. 3D has got to be stunning right from the get-go. It's got to be significantly different from the HD TV world that we've seen before. And that's why we're going to such lengths to try and find out how to make the best quality 3D that we possibly can. But I'm going to finish with a thought, in case you think this is all a gimmick, you know, a lion in your lap, a lover in your arms. It's not. Because while the 3D movie industry and the 3D television industry have been beating their brains out trying to solve the problems I've been articulating for you, 3D and stereoscopy and stereogrammetry and stereography have been quietly revolutionizing science, technology, industry, medicine, education, and a number of other areas. Stereosurgery has become so significant in vascular surgery and neurosurgery and certain internal gallbladder type surgeries as well, that if you don't see in 3D, you probably won't get a job in the hospital as a surgeon. it has revolutionized protein analysis and protein structure. And again, for those of you who can cross-fuse, this pops really beautifully if you can get it to do so. This is a myosin protein. Myosin's one of the family of proteins that make your muscles work. And people are designing proteins in 3D in ways that they wouldn't have been able to do before. And the same is true for nanotechnology. Again, this pops nicely if you can make it do it. This is a nano gear shaft comprised of individual atoms. Now, I'm not going to read through all these, and I don't expect you to either, but this is just a kind of a quick sketch of the sorts of things that are being, as I said, revolutionized by the application of stereopsis and stereogrammetry. Particularly the earth sciences, particularly design, anything that involves fluid flow or geology or molecular biology you see there, but also, of course, the military, and, of course, nuclear power design testing modeled in 3D because you can't get back into the reactor. So you have to be able to do that work virtually, if you like. And on it goes. There really is no limit to what 3D as a tool can offer science and technology. Yes, it will enhance entertainment, we hope, immensely and immeasurably, from games to television to movies and who knows where else thereafter, holograms and R2-D2 and all that kind of stuff. That'll be great. But I think that the impact of stereoptic capabilities is going to go way beyond the silver screen. I think it's going to continue to penetrate into industry, and I think it's going to continue to be a significant part of the future of our generation, our children's generation, and their children's generation. And that's one of the reasons why I think I can speak for some of us in the 3D movie industry is that we're so interested in collaborating with the vision health experts, because it's not just that they'll do better at school, it's that the society that we're all in will be the richer, the stronger, and the more imaginative and the more creative simply by being able to see stereoptically. So I think, as the White Rabbit would say, the clock is ticking. Time to get on with it, I think.